All right, let's move from one smart thinker to another. This man was named one of 35 men of influence under 35 years by GQ magazine and an exceptional industry guru in the Destiny Man magazine. He's sitting in front of me. I hope he's blushing. Now, he's just written an engaging book that he says addresses his assertion that the risk in the gap between what brands promise in social media and what the businesses behind those brands deliver in actuality is greater than having no social media brand presence whatsoever. The book is called Brand Schizo. Mike Stopforth, congratulations. Always nice to have your first book out. Why does this gap exist?
So the gap exists because I think brands have always enjoyed the ability to broadcast at their customers or at their stakeholders. With the advent of the internet and as a byproduct social media, those customers now have the opportunity to speak back. The luxury of broadcast, the luxury of that monologue, has been obliterated by the social web. And that gap now is social media shines a very uncomfortable spotlight in the gap between what brands traditionally have promised that is differentiated or segmented from what they deliver.
Typically, where would we see an overpromise failing in the consumer's mind?
I think this happens all the time. Brands develop taglines, develop corporate identities that have very ambitious statements behind them. Delivering that or scaling that in actuality becomes very difficult because ultimately a lot of these companies are speaking to tens, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of customers at one time. In the past, that could be contained in a call center or in a helpline or whatever it may be. When it's broadcast in this public space, it is exponentially and digitally showcased. And so this conversation becomes a archived digital repository of corporate failure and success.
So you make the following point. Brands have got to take a human approach. You've got to see your consumers as partners and not targets, and you have to value intimacy.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the values that we speak about would be intimacy. And this is we've unearthed, I mean, it sounds like we did something very smart, but we've looked at fundamental human truths that I think the industrial age of business did a very good job of taking out of the business equation. So I think in many ways, this social era of business has obliged us to acknowledge the individuality and the humanity of our staff and customer. And so what we've done is we've looked at values like conversation and authenticity and trust and sharing. These are values that drive things like Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube and Twitter, and how they come to blows with those principles that generally would drive big industrial age business.
And that's the holy brand grail because with a few notable exceptions, it is difficult for brands often to find their authentic voice.
Yeah, and I don't think authentic is about being infallible. Authentic is about consistency. Ironically enough, some of the least complained about brands on Twitter or on Facebook in South Africa are brands that you would normally understand to have very low service delivery. But the reason is they don't make big promises. So the expectation level of the client is aligned with the delivery level. With a brand that makes an enormous promise, I beg your pardon, Woolworths or an FNB, any slip up is deemed catastrophic. Because of the level of expectation. So they enjoy the luxury of very high levels of brand equity, but there's enormous risk inherent in that brand equity. So the key is not infallibility, the key is consistency.
But you can't ensure the process. You have to be part of the social media space. Or can brands simply say, I don't want to play there?
Well, I absolutely can opt out. And I don't think that anybody has ever said, I will not bank with this particular bank because they don't have a Twitter account. I mean, that's
absurd.
But I do think that brands potentially lose out on opportunities to showcase their approachability and humanity in that space. What we are realizing, though, that as brands endeavor to engage in the space as a byproduct of a need, I think, to stay competitive and to stay relevant in the eyes of their customers and their employees, that idea of embodying the complexity and the enormity of a typical corporate organization into one simple Twitter channel with a human voice, that's a very difficult task.
The book is called Brand Schizo. The author is Mike Stopforth from the agency Cerebra. Thank you very much indeed. It is a great read. The State versus Oscar Pistorius, celebrated media trial or a case that has put the media on trial itself. Karyn Maughan now examines the unprecedented broadcast of the Paralympians' prosecution and defence and just what impact it may have on future trial broadcasts.
Oscar Pistorius walks towards the Inyala that will take him to prison. His last few moments of freedom, like almost every other moment in this dramatic and emotional case, captured by a sea of cameras. Pistorius had made history. His trial was the first to be televised. But could it also be the last? National Director of Public Prosecutions, Mxolisi Nkosana, had made the call to not oppose the broadcast. Days before the Pistorius judgment, he told us he had no regrets.
All that I had to do was to balance his rights as against the rights of public, also again guard the interest of the witnesses, which I think that we managed. I was satisfied that that would be taken care of.
But Judge Thokozile Masipa made it clear in her ruling on Pistorius' guilt that the intense media interest around the case had a real impact on the credibility of most witnesses.
I continue to explain why most witnesses got their facts wrong. Almost every witness who was asked under cross-examination if he or she had followed the news relating to the events of 14 February 2013 or the bail proceedings or the trial proceedings responded positively. I am of the view that the probability is that some witnesses failed to separate what they knew personally from what they had heard from other people or what they had gathered from the media.
Masipa had reinforced what Pistorius' lawyers had argued, that broadcasting his trial would enable witnesses to tailor their evidence. The judge, however, chose to ignore the defence's pleas that she take the false media reports on the case into account when she sentenced him. These included stories suggesting that Pistorius had bludgeoned Steenkamp with a cricket bat, was on steroids, had fought with her over his alleged pornography usage, and had taken acting lessons for his trial. The Paralympian's lawyers had previously also claimed that several potential defense witnesses had refused to testify because they didn't want their testimony to be broadcast. We can't tell just how different Oscar Pistorius' case may have been if it hadn't been broadcast, but its airing has had a global impact. Amid the drama of the case, the United Kingdom's Lord Chief Justice, Lord Thomas, said that he was, quote, very troubled by what has happened in South Africa. He also called for a pause before any further decisions were made about whether trials in England and Wales should be televised. Weeks after the Pistorius judgment, the NPA in the Western Cape opposed the broadcast of the Shri and Dewani trial, stating that airing the case would not be in the interests of justice. The NPA and Dewani's lawyers were both concerned that unregulated media access could have a very negative impact on Dewani's health. It seems very unlikely that the Pistorius broadcast did not figure into the state's thinking on Dewani. This trial, with its graphic examination of a young woman's terrible death and her boyfriend's emotional unraveling, will invariably define if and how future cases can and should be broadcast. Karyn Maughan for Mags on Media.
On our next show, we'll get our feet wet as we speak to the founder of a leading beauty franchise, the astonishing brand story of Sorbet. Until then, you can get hold of us on Facebook and on Twitter. Goodbye to you, and thank you for watching.